It's a great privilege to be here, and I feel like I'm here on the wings of Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman, the great author and designer. Nancy Remieux from my office just pointed out that Mrs. Wharton's church, where she was married, stands behind us today. And sadly, it burned 2 years ago, but it's being rebuilt. And as New Yorkers, it's just wonderful to think about how these people who published this great book in 1897 are still very much present in our lives. And part of the reason that they are present is because they were deeply interested in classicism and the 65,000 years of tradition that goes behind classical design. And when I was a student, I read The Decoration of Houses. I bought a used copy at the University of Oregon and read it, and then I read it again at Winterthur when I was a graduate student. And then when we were invited to redecorate a room at the Mount, Edith Wharton's house, I read it yet again. And then last year, it occurred to me that a solid reread about how the book has influenced me and the greater world would be an interesting idea. And hence, today we're talking about The Decoration of Houses and the book that derived from that, Classical Principles for Modern Design. One of the great things was trying to figure out the cover for our book and looking at what Edith Wharton had used for the cover of her book and realizing that one image or picture couldn't sum it all up. It couldn't be a summary image that really said everything. And the book designers kept coming back to me and saying, a book without a picture on the cover won't sell, you have to come up with a picture. And then there was maybe 2 months of tension about how to make a book look appealing without an image of a room on it. And in the end, we all agreed there was not one picture that would sum it up, that would make it a whole statement. And through the wisdom and genius of graphic design, we were able to come up with this cover, which is based on wall decoration we made for a New York apartment. Edith Wharton, as many of you know, was the great novelist. She published, I think, 6 or 7 novels. She won the Pulitzer Prize, and her first book was about decoration. And she had spent her teens and 20s looking at buildings. She had enough money to travel and not work. And so she spent a lifetime, or her first part of her life, just going and looking at historic buildings and talking about them, and also wondering about how they affect people. And that, of course, went on to impact her literature. And her cohort, Ogden Codman, was a great designer in his own right, and he too had enough means to travel and look at buildings. And he was always looking at the built environment and how it was shaped. He lived in Boston, and a great deal of Federal Boston still existed when he was alive, so he was influenced by that. Sadly, much of it burned later in his life, but he saw pretty much new colonial Boston in all of its great Federal architecture. This is an example of Codman's designs, and you can see I guess we call it Edwardian taste today, classical, tight, enriched, but extremely academic and well organized. His most famous commission was working on the breakers, the second floor for Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the exterior of the breakers and the interior that he designed for it. And you see it has a very princely and noble quality about it. And her house, the Mount, which was begun by Codman, but they had a fight, and finished by Hoppen. And interestingly, she was such a Francophile, but the house is based on Belton, the English house. And just a little bit of her interior of her drawing room at the Mount. And interestingly, she was eschewing all the heavy Victorian taste of her parents. Imagine, brocade and Belter furniture and heaviness. And she was looking for a lighter and more classical 18th century taste. But looking at the pictures today, we're thinking, wow, that's pretty heavy and Victorian looking. So it's all perspective about what is light and airy. And her library, much more classical room that we probably could respond to a little better today. And her own bedroom, which was decorated with toile. And there was a whole revival in toile decoration in the 19th century when bedrooms no longer were formal rooms. Until Edith Wharton's childhood, bedrooms were sometimes used for parties or public events, much like at Versailles, the royal bedchamber was actually had a social function rather than just purely for sleeping. But she was excited that the bedroom was becoming a personal enclave. I think the reason that Edith Wharton's and Codman's book still holds up and why we still celebrate it is because they were the first people to go through and organize it systematically by chapters with specific types. You can see they wrote on the historical tradition, rooms in general, walls, doors, windows, fireplaces, ceilings and floors, down to my favorite chapters on gala rooms, ballrooms, saloons, music rooms, and galleries. And so we largely followed that framework. My co-author and I decided to use the organization of Edith Wharton's book, and we also occurred to us that many, many decorating books follow the same format. So this architecture that they gave us in their literature has continued to inform us today. A classic is classic because of a certain eternal and irrepressible freshness. For a year, I've been telling everyone in my office that I'm irrepressibly fresh. It hasn't worked. That was one of the chapters that was so interesting to write about, is to read about what the historical tradition that Wharton and Codman celebrated and what it entailed, and how hard it was to reconstruct that today, because the classical tradition is so many things. And finally, we came upon the idea of writing about what resonates with me about the classical tradition, because it was unwieldy to talk about the whole classical tradition for all 65,000 years of it. What I respond to is the sense of order, that in a classical environment you know where to go, sit, and you feel comfortable, that the proportions are flattering to people. And it allays confusion. And it occurred to me that our world is bilaterally symmetrical and also, by its nature, asymmetric, and therefore to build symmetry in order to live an asymmetrical life makes sense. So that was a big idea, is that we love symmetry, but obviously when you start living in a space, it becomes asymmetrical. And that was the largest idea from the classical tradition. And Wharton and Codman were very excited because in the 1890s, everyone was looking at classical buildings and wanted to imitate them. They were so pleased that Americans were picking the best models and imitating them. And the Columbian exhibition had just happened a few years before their book, so they're in this whole firmament of people who are admiring classicism, imitating it, and applying it to their lives. And by the time they died in the 1930s, the world was much different, and the modernism had arrived, and they were, I guess, looking back in nostalgia to the 1890s. And this is just an example of a classical room that we designed with Peter Penoyer's office at Drumlin Hall, and it really entails everything about that Wharton and Codman liked: symmetry, clear sense of entrance. You know what to do, you know where to go. It's pretty hilarious because when we were looking at the picture, my husband, who's a stylist, said, we should have moved the other racamier to the other side to make it perfectly symmetrical, to make the picture symmetrical. And I said, well, that's the whole point, is it's symmetrical, but of course real life made it asymmetrical. So I think it's okay we have this slight break. And in fact, good design is tension. It is the ability to, it's like, I always think it's analogous to when you dress a woman and obviously she's going to be symmetrical, but then you put one brooch on the side and it throws the composition off, and that makes it design. So the tension, creating that tension, is what design is. So we like order, but you have to break the order in order for the order to make sense. A classic example of the historical tradition, but the use of historic elements to create a contemporary room. This room was built in the 1930s, and we redecorated it last year. radically redecorated. You can tell with the is this contemporary decoration or is this historicist decoration? I mean, I think you can tell it's not from the 18th century by the painted floor and the combination of things. However, it obviously relies heavily on the 18th century. One of the key ideas in the decoration of houses is treating walls like an order, with a base and a cornice, much like a capital. And that is the one idea that a junior designer takes on, and you can extrapolate into a whole career. Of course, they give you these really highfalutin and grand examples, but they argue that every room, whether it be by a simple carpenter or by the grandest architect, is a success because it has a base and a cornice and something on the wall to connect the base and the cornice together, whether it be a plaster wall or a paneled wall or pilasters, or in this case, tapestry and a series of paneling based on paintings. And as contrast, I offer this relatively simple American house by Ferguson and Shamami, but designed by Richard Cameron. The simplest of base and an enriched ceiling, and then we've highlighted it with a decorative paper and a printed border. And the grandest example in the office, this is a room by Wyatt in Dorset that we redecorated this year with Peregrine Bryant in Britain. Our American clients bought it, and I thought I'd pretty much done everything in my career that I could possibly do, and opportunity knocked. But for an American to work on a room of this scale was pretty special. And you can see here the use of a base and a cornice and a vaulted ceiling. And then the window designed by Wyatt was restored. The original window had been removed, and this so-called Wyatt window rebuilt. Notably, the columns are replicas in scaglioli. It's a pretty fantastic piece of restoration. In the President's House at Yale, a 1930s house, again you can see the value of the classical order of a base and a cornice. Relatively simple. The house was, the interiors were done in the 1930s, so they have this really stripped back, sort of almost deco feeling, partly out of economy and partly out of a sensibility. And we sort of revved up the dining room with this great 18th century pattern to make the room more ceremonial. And a room that we designed with Peter Penoyer again in a New York townhouse where there was very little architecture and a low ceiling. And you can see the very thin pilasters connecting to a base. And the cornice is pretty much stepped on the ceiling for height and all plaster. When we finished the room and I started writing the book, I felt immediate vindication because this is Edith Wharton's dining room about 5 blocks away from the house we designed. So I hadn't remembered seeing this room when I read the book, but it was endorsement from the grave when we realized how closely we had imitated the historic model. Windows. A large unbroken sheet of plate glass interrupts the decorative scheme of the room. How ironic that she wrote this in 1897, and she was extremely excited that picture windows were going out of style and that people were finally restoring architecture to fenestration, because she felt so much. She and Codman both felt that the divisions in a window introduced the landscape into the room, and it made an indoor-outdoor connection. And today, of course, people think an unbroken piece of glass allows the view to come in more easily, and I think that's contradicted. And here, as an example, she showed this great room and this great window, and with it the argument that if you have beautiful architecture, if you have beautiful windows, you don't need curtains. The windows set the whole tenor for the room. And just as a point of contrast, the room we had to decorate, we were forced to decorate, designed by Richard Meyer, with obviously no fenestration. In fact, glass on 3 sides. And how impossible to make a satisfying and embracing room with glass on every angle. And this is exactly the kind of room that she thought was being effaced. And a point of triumph, the curved windows designed by, we did with Peter Penoyer in Maine, in this perfect bow over the water. And obviously it is a room that does not need curtains. And then a recent example of a picture window in our office. So sometimes we do picture windows too. The fate of the door is a curious one. Codman and Wharton are writing about doors in 1897 saying people are getting rid of doors and we don't understand why they're doing it. Doors cause discretion, gives you privacy, and of course modernist architects were really excited to be getting rid of as many doors as possible, or hiding them, or pocket doors, the whole Victorian vocabulary that we've all adapted to. And so it was just wonderful to think about how important doors are. And you seem like a heretic when you go into a meeting and say, well, how about a door there? And they go, oh no, we want this big open plan. And Wharton and Codman thought that living in one room was a regression. And sometimes my clients, when I say they should have a door, think I'm regressive. An historic example of a door from the decoration of houses, and my contretemps with a contemporary architect about, okay, well, if we have to have an opening with no door, but can we at least have an overdoor, or can we give it some sort of sense of architecture? And so, after a couple of meetings, we got to this level of enrichment, which was still better than just having an opening with no casing or architrave or any celebration. But I suppose if you brought that picture of Versailles to a meeting and saying that you should have a door like this, I think they would think you were a heretic. So we'll see. And a great example in the far west of a modern building that we were able to remodel. And this is we had no doors. It was all very glass, and the clients are old-fashioned. So we made these beautiful wood and metal doors as the entrance to their house, and just sort of reimpose the idea of having a solid front door in the far west is for closure. And in the main hall, we made these really giant doors into their living room, again for ceremony. This is a great example of a high level of decoration that the ranch is very simple and rugged. It takes 2 hours to get there, partly by dirt road. So it was just wonderful to give the arriving guests this kind of great ceremonial entrance, and that's how the Chinese chandelier came about. There had been a antler chandelier in that location, and I was using it because I thought, well, all ranches should have antler chandeliers, and I was shifting my weight about it. And one day the ranch manager came up to me and said, you don't have to use that chandelier because it came from China. So ironically, they got another Chinese lantern, albeit without antlers. And this is the room beyond with a pair of formal doors entering into the rather informal living room. On curtains, lingerie effects do not combine well with architecture, and the more architecturally a window is treated, the less it needs to be dressed up in ruffles. This goes back to what I said, if an architect delivers you with beautiful windows, you don't have to put lingerie on it. However, we found this great plate for decorative curtains in the Smithsonian, and we thought it looked pretty swell. So we had our own little essay in lingerie effects. And this is a great example of not always listening to Codman and Wharton and listening to their philosophic advice, but sometimes not always following it to the letter. And here you can see the curtains imitated in swags and jabos on the side windows. And then Drumlin Hall, which had great neoclassical architecture that demanded curtains. And Codman and Wharton thought that anything after the French Revolution was debased and not worth looking at. But the 19th century fabric became inexpensive enough that it could be used architecturally. And so therefore we decided to make architectural curtains. And here's the engraving that we based as a model. And then the delivered curtains. On dining rooms and ballrooms or gala rooms, the true mark of a well-decorated ballroom is to always look ready for a ball. An example of a dining room that they used as, a model. And a reception room, a high-studded room always ready for a party. The idea of having a dining room is pretty out of style, but I feel like if you have the luxury of space, to have a dining room is a really great thing. And I argue with my clients that it's okay to have a room that's just for parties, rather than having a bunch of rooms that have vague use. If you can have a dining room, great. And if you can have a ballroom, it's even better. Considering how big American houses can become, a ballroom doesn't seem that out of character. So I've been arguing for ballrooms for about half my career, and for about a third of my career for private chapels. And I'm still waiting for that commission. In fact, part of the reason I'm here today is to make sure that all of you know that I'd like to design a ballroom and a private chapel. We might be able to combine them with the dining room, but I'm not sure yet. In the ranch, we had this big room that had no purpose because it was a remodeling, and I said, well, why don't we just make a big, grandiose dining room? And that's how it turned about. We made a room that seats 20, and they only use it for special occasions. And then, as an ornament, we made this wonderful glass fireplace with Miriam Illner. And an example of a really old-fashioned, traditional dining room for an American client. And it's pretty fancy, and you feel a little formal in the room, but it's also really wonderful to be surrounded with such beautiful things. So I don't think they're obsolete, but they do take a little bit of effort to use. And then an example of a ballroom, the only near example we have of a ballroom was this large room at the ranch, which we just finished. And I said, listen, let's just have a lightly furnished and keep it pushed to the sides and set it up for parties. And it's turned out to be a really actively used room. They use it for programs and dances, and the ranch manager just retired, and they gave a big retirement party there. So it's turned out to be a really great space, and made better with Mark Beard's mural of American mammals. And another view of the room. So, in conclusion, I'd like to repeat that great quote that a classic is a classic not because it conforms to certain structural rules or fits certain definitions. It is a classic because of a certain eternal and irrepressible freshness.